Welcome to our podcast. I'm Karen Avari.
And I am Nuala Gage. Together, we are the safety collaborators and co-founders of Safety Collaborations.
So we help people change the way they think about safety. In fact, we are passionate about it.
And we do this by engaging in dialogue and testing the levels of trust and psychological safety, which are core to organisational culture.
Making safety part of your DNA so that your people speak up, show up, do right, and become safer every day for yourself, your team, and your business.
Our free podcasts intend to share nuggets of wisdom that will challenge your perspectives, potentially solve a nagging problem, share actions that you can implement, and give you at least one aha moment.
We come with many years of experience in delivering safety culture change programs across the globe for high-hazard industries. Join us weekly and let's change the way people think about safety together. Now, let's get on with the show.
In our last episode, we asked, how do you make your teams feel included so that they can speak up, stop the job, and trust their gut feelings without being ostracized by the bigger group? This week's podcast jumps right back into that conversation. So let's carry on where we left off.
I think the next question actually leads quite nicely into what we've just been talking about, and it's more around communication and decision making. So how are informal and formal decisions reached in the local community, or let's say within the group or the team, your community is whatever it is on the day. Yeah, that's an interesting one. And it's, well, I'm going to leave you to, because we both know what we're going to say here, but yeah. So how are you going to frame that one for us today?
Well, for me, I think it really, especially when we're looking at decisions in our working environment and in high hazard industries, which is where we play the most, is around those written and unwritten rules. And what are the decisions made around those written and unwritten rules, and how do they come into play? And who is the ultimate decision maker? Because, and I promise leaders out there, I'm not attacking you in any sense of the way, because I'm thinking about the answer I gave earlier as well. But at the same time, I do feel that these are really tough but important questions to ask yourselves and to answer. Let's say we have a piece of engineering equipment on site, and they need to be tied together. But the tie-up doesn't quite fit, whether it's the spool, the flange, or, whatever that piece of equipment is, it doesn't quite work. It's a couple of mils out. The rule is that we stop the job, we send the problem to the engineering department, which may be on another continent, generally in another country, generally in another time zone. And we let them look at it and come back to us with an answer. But we also know that that is going to delay the job by anything between a few hours, a few days, or possibly even a few weeks. And we have this pressure sitting on us to get the job done, to get it moving forward, because that particular piece of equipment may delay a very, very large part of the project. What do? Do we stop the job? Or do we, in that moment, with the information that we have, make a plan to get it to work, to get it to fit together? And we may never know that somebody made a plan. We may only find out 5 to 10, 15, 20 years later when that piece of equipment fails. So who is the ultimate decision maker? And how are we promoting the conversation? One to start, and one to have comfort of being able to start the conversation. And often the informal rules or the informal way of looking at things is, I'll rather get the job done than delay it, because I don't want to be labeled as the person who cost time, money, and productivity on this job. And for me, in many ways, that is absolutely terrifying. But it is absolutely a reality. We all have unwritten rules. whether it's the chair that you sit at when you go into the boardroom or into the mess hall. I've been on sites where I've sat down to have lunch and they're like, oh, no, don't sit at that chair. That's so-and-so's chair. And I'm going, oh, I don't see a label. I'm sorry, but is there a name attached to this chair? But that is the unwritten rule. And we end up living by unwritten rules and not realizing that someone else has made that decision for us and we're just going with the flow.
Interesting. I think it goes back to our very first question around cultural norms. It starts to form part of that cultural norm of the organisation or the team, the group, the situation we're in. Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that those cultural norms or those unwritten rules are always wrong. Sometimes those unwritten rules are the things that actually save our lives.
Yeah.
And that make things happen in a positive way. But for me, it's around saying we can't block them out. We can't pretend that they're not there. But what we can do is we can question and say, how do these add value to the business, the team, the ultimate goal of what we want to achieve? And the other one, which links back again to our inclusion question, is how do we allow the people who are coming into the team with fresh eyes, who will be the ones who go, but why is it done like this? Where I've been before, we did it this way. To be able to say those and to be able to have those conversations without being told, we've always done it this way, so just get on with it. And really bring it back to creating that space that, and I'm not talking about, let's all get warm and fuzzy and sing Kumbaya, but what I am saying is, how are you creating that space in your working environment where people feel comfortable to say, I find this a bit odd, or I'm concerned about this, or, we might have this procedure that has gone from being 10 to 60 pages long, but actually what happens on the floor is that we skip pages 25 to 59 and we go straight to 60. So how do we rewrite the procedure?
Exactly.
And those are the important things for me.
And that is where innovation happens. So that's, again, around, if we go back to those, thinking about the 4 stages of psychological safety, it's allowing then, how do we challenge the status quo and how do we feel safe to do so? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Without being labeled as the loudmouth or the stirrer or the oddball.
Yep, all of those labeling things that we as human beings like to do. When we talk about communication and decision-making, some other areas to take into consideration, particularly when we're talking about cultural diversity. And in these environments, that cultural diversity is really important as well in those norms, yeah, and in creating them and how the rules are written or not, what's formal, what's informal. When we talk about communication, it's where are we, how direct do we need to be, how indirect do we need to be? When we come to decision making, we think about what are the rules, what are the relationships? And if we think of in the unwritten rules, they tend to form out of relationships rather than the actual formal rules.
Very much so. And you actually just reminded me of something which I'd forgotten about, in the whole moment. As you've noticed, I can get quite impassioned. But
that's why we're here together.
Exactly. But around the cultural awareness and sensitivity of informal, formal, written and unwritten rules, because in certain cultural norms, it's very disrespectful to question somebody who is considered an elder, a leader, a supervisor, a person in authority. And it would be incredibly impolite to be given an instruction by someone, even if you know 100% that it is going to cause a problem, whether it's going to cause an incident, whether it's going to cause a failure, whatever the case may be. But culturally, you have been either brought up or it's just the way that you know. It's just for you, the norm is that you do not question that. So you will go out and you will do the job or perform the task the way that you've been instructed. and then be absolutely taken aback when something goes wrong and all of a sudden it's put on you as to, well, why did you do that if you knew it was going to go wrong?
Yeah.
But I was instructed to do it that way.
Yeah.
And how do we embrace that and find ways of communicating? And we may get to it at a later stage in this conversation around the questions that we ask to clarify and to come back to that clear understanding of what I think I'm communicating is what you're actually hearing and understanding.
Mm-hmm. I'll leap ahead to another question on that one, actually. And I say leap ahead. You can't actually see that, our lovely audience. But anyway, there is another question between these two. And I'm going to answer this question with a quote, actually. Is the speaker or the listener more responsible for accuracy in understanding? And what I'd like you to consider, there's a lot of talk about how we communicate and how we share knowledge and how we pass on the instructions that we need to. Now, in reality, in organizations, conversational waste is probably one of the greatest costs to every organization. How many times do we have to tell somebody or ask somebody or make a request of someone before we think it gets done the way we want it to, whatever our standards are? May not be the standards of the organization. They might be just my standards. Yeah. So I'd like you to ponder this. We're not going to deep into this because we're going to do another session on this one. But if one can only remember one rule for communication, it should be that communication is about triggering the right response instead of sending the right message.
Oh, my word. I just love that.
It spins communication on its, as we often think about it, on its head. It flips it.
Yeah.
And when we think of cultural diversity, or if we want to be in a situation, which is kind of where we're heading to here, is thinking about how do we create that third cultural space, which means that multiple cultures come together to create a new working relationship, a new working culture, if you like. No, it's about, well, what do we need to do to have the appropriate conversations? What is the right communications to have to trigger the right responses so that everybody, regardless of whether they're indirect communicators, direct communicators, time-oriented planners or relationship people-oriented planners, how do we bring all of those together? And I just think that really, it triggers something in you to really think about that.
That absolutely does. So I'm going to ask you the question again, and I'm going to ask you to read that quote again because I think everyone needs to hear it one more time.
Yeah.
Is the speaker or the listener more responsible for accuracy in understanding?
If one can only remember one rule for communication, it should be that communication is about triggering the right response instead of sending the right message. So we've still got a couple more questions to go. I'm going to have a look at... We're going to talk a little bit more on this one, I guess, and it's still around the communication, actually. So what are noticeable aspects of the non-verbal behaviour of people?
Gosh, I think that is such an unexplored topic because we don't generally, I don't think, and please correct me, Kaz and audience, if I'm wrong here, but pay huge amounts of attention to the non-verbal communication. And I was working on a job in Asia, and there was a lot of tension amongst the team, specifically between the expats and the nationals, because things just weren't happening the way that they wanted them to, and things were slow, and people weren't communicating effectively. And in the toolbox talks, we got them from having like people just standing in a row in front of them to actually doing a circular toolbox talk for inclusion so that everybody could be a part of the conversation. my colleague and I noticed that there was always one person, once the circle was completed, would take a half a step forward. So they were not obviously in front of everybody, but they were in front of everybody. And it was very curious. And we started questioning, well, what is that about? And starting to watch the body language. And as the supervisor would be going through the toolbox talk for the day and what have you, the attention wasn't on the supervisor. The attention of most of the workforce was on the person whose feet were just half a step in front of everybody else. And it turned out that that person, although was just seen as a worker by the supervisor, was a cultural leader in that environment. And not much would happen and not much would be done and no questions would be asked by anybody else unless he gave the slightest indication of positivity. And it was just so subtle. And it was amazing to watch. And as we started including those conversations and finding out a little bit more around that particular group's cultural norms and the way that things were done, and we started getting buy-in for what was needing to be done by that cultural leader, even though he had no title, things moved so much more effectively in the job. And do we notice these things, or do we come in with our own cultural biases and go, well, I've given you a position and therefore you must follow it, even though culturally, when you leave and go home, you may have the position of supervisor, but you will be ostracized by your community for not following the expectation of the cultural norm. And it was such an eye-opening lesson for me, because here I am thinking, I've traveled to so many places, I've experienced so many different cultures, and yet I had been completely insensitive to the subtle non-verbal behaviors of one of the groups that I've been working with. And it really has been a huge lesson. And like I said to you earlier, we learn. Do we always get it right? Do we always transfer that learning perfectly? Absolutely not. And I think we would all be naive if we thought we could.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know,
I think as humans, and any of us who, particularly those of us who work in this space of helping people to become learners, the more we know, the less we know. The more of the world, the more of the world I've seen, the less I seem to have seen. So we're forever to master something. You almost have to learn, unlearn, and learn again. And opening up that door is well, if you like it, it's part of the joy, of this work that we do anyway. I've been in similar situations in different parts of the world, and you really have to become an observer, and we are each observers of our own world. You and I will not have seen that situation in the same way. Nobody does. Everyone sees colours in their own eyes, in their own way, if they can. Which kind of brings me almost to the next question. But anyway, so yeah, very much. We're just adding this question in for a little fun. At what distance do people normally stand from each other when in conversation?
Well, considering that I live in South Africa and I do quite like my personal space, but I'd have on occasion gone to the shops and been standing in a queue, even during COVID, and had to look at the person behind me because I can feel their breath on my neck and go, could you just move an arm's length away, please?
I remember when my first big move was to Hong Kong, and I mean, I absolutely loved it. It was a fantastic time. But what did I have to really overcome? And I say I had to overcome, and it took me a while, was I went to try and catch a bus to get in a lift. It didn't matter what, really, If a person didn't actually just push forward and get in, you was left waiting on the sidewalk. And trust me, for the first couple of weeks, I was often left waiting on the sidewalk because I come from a very, kind of rules-based culture where you wait in a queue and you wait your turn and you do all that stuff. Well, if you do that in some parts of the world, you'll still be there when you're 100, right? Because it's true. It's true, yeah. So I had to learn, and I'm not a small person. I mean, I'm not big, but I mean, I'm bigger than the average in Hong Kong. So in the end, I had to sort of like, right, put my elbows out, and this is hard for someone who I'm actually generally speaking, a very, very polite person, and because that's the world view I come from. But I ended up, the only way I could deal with this was to actually put my elbows out. And I know, audience, you can't see me, but Nuala can. Put my elbows out, right? Cover up the chest, so to speak, and just literally thought to myself, well, I'm bigger than you. I'm getting on this bus. And it was the only way I could actually get there. So the space thing, and then there's other times when you're just like, okay, I like 3 feet in front of me. Please don't step into it, So the impact then on how do we have conversations and how do we communicate, again, is really interesting. I've also been on the workplace, in the work site, where you've got certain communities, they like to really huddle together. They may speak very loudly, actually. I might think they're shouting or about to learn in a fight, when actually they're not. They're just making sure everybody's getting heard, but they like to close in on you, which can be quite daunting if you're not that person. So again, it's about understanding the cultural diversity that you have, and making room for all of it, and not assuming it has to be this way or that way, because it isn't.
It absolutely isn't. And it doesn't mean that you need to lose the essence of who you are.
Absolutely.
But be open enough to embrace the essence of who others are.
Mm. I like this story you took when we were talking earlier in preparing for this. You talked about this colorblind example, and how does a person's status affect when they may speak in a social group? And this kind of ties in the last 2 questions in some ways. Yeah. So maybe share that colorblind story.
So in case anybody's wondering, it's actually a facilitation exercise. It's not about dealing with people who don't physically see the world the way that we do.
Exactly.
Exactly. So colorblind is a facilitation exercise that we use. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of what it is that you put everybody into a seated circle. Everyone gets a blindfold.
Sorry. There's an online version of it.
I believe so. We have to try this. I'm so excited about that. Yes.
Well, let's describe the real one, the first one.
We'll describe the real one. So picture everybody seated in a circle. So you can hear everyone, blindfold on, so you can't see everyone. And you have a whole lot of different shapes of, what are they called? Pieces of plastic, whatever.
Pieces of plastic.
And
puzzle pieces.
Puzzle pieces. They're different shapes and they're different colors. And as a facilitator, out of the entire pack, you take 2 random pieces out and you put that in your pocket. You hand the rest out to everybody in the room. So some people may have 2 or 3 pieces. Some people may have less or more. And between the group, they need to figure out which shapes and which colors you as a facilitator have in your pocket. And it is a wonderful team communication exercise, because unless everyone communicates, you're never going to get the answer. But the problem is, when you're dealing with a team where it is not culturally polite to question somebody else, and when you hear someone either saying something that contradicts what they said 5 minutes ago, or that someone just clearly can't have that piece because you're the one who's got that piece in your hand, but you're going to keep quiet because culturally it is just so disrespectful to speak up. This exercise can take anything from 20 minutes to an hour and a half, because until the group realizes that everyone has to be included in the conversation, as uncomfortable as that may be for some, and how those who may try to dominate the conversation need to learn to back down and give other people space, as uncomfortable as that may be for them, the answer and the solution is never going to come out. And there have been a few jobs in different countries across, I've mostly worked in Asia and Africa, so those are my reference points, where it's been remarkably visible as a facilitator as to how culturally unaware we are of the people that we work with. And I've loved doing that exercise because the non-verbal communication, the verbal communication, the way of dealing with each other just comes through so clearly. And when you see those light bulbs coming on in the different team members around, hang on a sec, I have been dealing with this person for sometimes 6 months, sometimes a couple of years, yet the way that I have been interacting with them has always been putting them in such an uncomfortable position that they will never speak up and tell me what's really going on. And they walk out of there with such a different viewpoint and a different, stronger team, because it's just around changing our perspectives, changing the questions that we ask. So instead of going, you will do things this way, or you will tell this, or whatever the case is, or asking a random question around, in a toolbox talk, who has an issue that they want to deal with, because everyone will look at you wide-eyed, is about taking that communication offline. And like I said, it's not about changing who I am. It's about embracing who others are and really going, okay, well, when I'm dealing with this particular person, this is their background, this is their understanding. As the leader in this group, how do I communicate with that person in a cultural way that makes sense to them?
Absolutely. And I guess I'm going to repeat this, but it's about triggering the right response, not sending the right message.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more there. And I think we find that very uncomfortable and quite difficult as leaders often, because I think it can be seen as a leader, do I need to be seen as a chameleon? And no, it's not about being seen as a chameleon, but it is about being seen as caring. It's about being seen as adaptable. It's about being seen as, I will match my message to the norm of the person that I am trying to communicate with. And when we start doing that and we start seeing the results and the rewards of doing that, I think it just flows so much more easily. And I think our blinkers get taken off as leaders.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And it sounds, I think it always, it probably sounds like to leaders or whoever's listening to us that, oh my gosh, this all sounds like really hard work. We never said it was going to be easy. And when we're dealing with other human beings, there's always going to be work involved. But the joy of, I was going to say getting it right, but that's not the right term. But the joy of feeling mutual success, actually. And I think it's mutual, where both of us, I as the leader or I as the person receiving an instruction or an offer to do something or whatever the case may be, when we have a joint understanding of what needs to be achieved mutually, is so satisfying for everybody.
Yeah, it is. And you said something interesting there where we didn't say it would be easy, but oh my goodness, is it worthwhile?
Yeah, it certainly is. And that's a wrap for today. Thank you for joining us today. It's always lovely to have these conversations that matter. We'll be delighted if you share this podcast and hit the subscribe button on your preferred podcast platforms such as Apple or Spotify, etc. Connect with us via our website www.safetycollaborations.com, where you will find the show notes for today's episode. Email us at hello@safetycollaborations.com. We'd be delighted to hear from you. We are easy to find on LinkedIn. Just look out for either Nuala Gage or Karen Avari and follow our company page, Safety Collaborations. Until next week, stay safe and stay well.